Thank you for joining our workshop on strategic corruption. My name is Claudia. I'm the Managing Director of the Basel Institute on Governance, and I'll be moderating a session with four really amazing panelists and experts. I'm very proud to have them here. I'll start by introducing them perhaps first. The first lady on my immediate left is Claudia Baez, who heads our previously called public governance. Now I actually have to read my notes because we just renamed her department to be called Prevention, Research and Innovation, and I should of course know that. At the Basel Institute, and Claudia's team works on applying innovative research methods, governance and anti-corruption programs, very much so democratic backsliding and those sort of things. Immediately to the left then is, I'm going to try to speak it, pronounce it properly.
Good luck.
Good luck. Oh, well done. She's obviously Spanish. Yes, she's head of advocacy at Transparency International's Defense and Security Program. Transparency International, for those who don't know, is sort of the big global movement, global anti-corruption movement. They have a dedicated program on security and defense. This is the first time we work together, but the beginning of a lovely partnership, I hope. On her left is Olena Trego, who's the Secretary General of NACO, which probably is an abbreviation for something in Ukrainian, but is really the Independent Defense Anti-Corruption Commission. With the word commission, you would think it's a government commission, but it's not. It's an independent civil society organization that looks at corruption in various aspects and sectors affecting security in Ukraine. And of course, no need to explain why the context in Ukraine is of particular importance at the moment. And last, not least, gentlemen, these days come last for some reason. Is Martin Vladimirov, who is the Director for Energy and Climate Program at the Center for the Study of Democracy in Bulgaria, which doesn't only work in Bulgaria, but really in the wider region of Southeastern Europe and Eastern Europe. And he's also the author of something called the Kremlin Playbook. And I think we'll hear what the Kremlin is, kind of game the Kremlin is playing from Martin. So we're really excited to have this workshop here. And I'd like to thank swisspeace. Oh, wonderful. Laurent is just coming in. Thank you very much, Laurent, for allowing us to come with this topic to the Basel Peace Forum. It'd be very interesting if I can ask how many people were kind of surprised to see corruption on the agenda of a peace. That kind of obvious and
surprise, yeah.
Surprise.
I know what I mean.
More like we've been waiting for that to come to Basel Peace for months. Thank you so much. See, Laurent, what a good idea we have there. We usually speak to the anti-corruption bubble. To be honest, outreaching into new communities is super important, but we don't necessarily always have that chance. So we're really delighted to be able to talk to you. I guess you're all more from the peace, policy, advocacy, academic space. Is that roughly right? Hugh works very regularly on corruption and governance issues, apart from my own team. Okay.
Tech for
governance.
Good, yeah.
Tech for good.
I mean, tech for catching bad guys.
We like that. Bad guys also use tech to catch money, but we'll talk about that. Anyway, so I think hopefully this is a bit of a mutual learning session. We do have four panelists who have a lot to say, but I don't want to wait till the end. So please feel free to raise your hand, maybe not in the middle of a sentence, but do signal if you want to ask a question. We can also, disagree. Thank you. You can also come with dissenting voices, with challenges. So this is a bit of a schoolroom setting, but please just come in whenever you want. So I'm going to start with Claudia. If you could please kick us off, maybe with the big picture about cause and effect. What do you see, or what are the big ways in which you feel corruption affects security? And perhaps also how this may or may not be different in different political contexts, very stable democracies, are they even affected by this problem, yes or no? Very fragile context, backsliding with democracy. Give us the big picture to start with.
Perhaps better. I have a few slides.
Yes. You have slides.
Okay, so basically what Greta is asking me and what I wanted to do to get us started is to give a kind of overarching framework to structure our thinking. So we'll be talking about how corruption impacts security outcomes. And here we're talking about a very, very large thematic space, right? So just to give ourselves a few pointers and ideas how we start tackling this huge topic, I think it's clearly the case that the links are multidimensional. But I think what is really, really important is that corruption impacts security because corruption affects the way state power is exercised. And in doing so, it will have an impact on security outcomes. So there are, of course, many, many different ways in which corruption manifests. But just to give you a taste of what I mean, and looking at some of the big level typologies of corruption, we have cases of countries that suffer from endemic corruption, right? So this means there are countries where the rule of law is really weak, institutions are really weak. So it's very difficult to enforce formal mandates, formal policies. And on the other hand, it's very easy to exploit political power and authority. So these are cases of countries where we see corruption pretty much at every level, where citizens, whenever they are confronted with state institutions for whatever need they have, will be confronted with corruption. And then, of course, this has implications, right? So when the rule of law is weak, I mean, it is often the case that the political elites, they are not necessarily weak, but they are not following the law. They might be guided by informal norms, informal arrangements, informal coalitions. But in any case, this whole environment weakens the capacity to govern and enforce policy through formal institutions. And ultimately, this means that for citizens, they are confronted with a state that is unable to deliver basic public services. So what are the implications? Well, corruption in such a scenario very, very severely is going to erode trust in the state, is going to affect legitimacy of the state, and of course, it increases inequalities and poverty. So in this sense, corruption fuels insecurity because people are poor and destitute, and in this way, desperate, they cannot be protected by the state. But also importantly, in such a scenario, it's very rare that the institutions of state security, army, law enforcement, police would be untouched from corruption. It's obviously, in most cases, the opposite situation. And here we have circumstances where, for example, a crisis arises. It might be a natural disaster or even a terrorist attack. And the state institutions that are mandated with protecting the citizenship are unable to do so because they are so degraded from corruption. So this is one example. Another example is what I'm calling here state capture, which is a rather different situation in which a group of political elites, often associated with financial elites as well, they exercise strong power over the institution of the state, and rather they instrumentalize the state. The state institutions are instrumentalized as to favor and to bias decisions towards benefiting these small nucleus of elites. So this can be done in ways that are, made to seem legal. So-called tailor-made laws are quite prevalent in situations of state capture. And also, importantly, very often the repressive capacities of the state are instrumentalized. So here we see situations where maybe there are decent regulations and laws for anti-corruption, but they are used selectively to go against dissenters and opponents. So in this sense, corruption is used by the powers to be to consolidate power, to ensure impunity. And obviously this enables abuse of the state in such a way that for any opposition or dissenting voices, that they really have very little, if any, institutional mechanisms by way of which to exercise their voice and their opposition. So therefore, corruption fuels radicalization of oppressed groups. Last but not least, in my quick typology, strategic corruption, which will be a huge topic today, as you know, where the state power, the exercise of state powers is weaponized and used to undermine targets abroad and to destabilize other countries. So obviously, this kind of corruption is very much underpinning cases where deliberately democratic institutions and democratic order is destabilized from abroad. Such type of instrumentalization and abuse of state power is also often done by funding conflict, by funding violent groups, providing weapons. So contributing to polarization and also emboldening and creating a situation where fake news, misinformation prevails, and thus allowing further erosion of a democratic order. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yes.
Thanks, hello everybody. You forgot the first step. Define corruption. I mean, I live in my city council. Everything you described there, happening all the time. Family ties, ideologies.
Yeah.
This is my daily food.
Yeah.
When it starts to be corruption, or when is it admissible?
Yeah. Well, you're opening a very broad debate. We could debate what is corruption all day. I'm going to go with TI's definition, which is the most widely accepted, which states that corruption is a misuse of, trusted power.
So there is not a legal definition in international law of what a corruption is. So normally it goes for the trans international definition, that is the abuse of entrusted power. And then as such, I think most of you will think corruption immediately is bribery and exchange of, in an alley. But it goes beyond that. It is nepotism, is fraud, obviously money laundering, but things like sextortion. So like imagine a migrant trying to escape, a refugee trying to escape a country in conflict and has to go through checkpoints, controls, and someone said, you had to give me sexual favors and I will let you and your children pass. So that's also corruption because that official society has entrusted power to that official and is abusing it for his private gain. Sorry for...
No. I think suffice to say that it's also an evolving discussion because we also learn more about forms of corruption that we have previously seen.
Some people have a technical role.
So you're very right in that, if we take this definition, which is broad, we then can see and do see corruption everywhere. And where the hard boundaries of where corruption stops and other, less bad things begin is completely unclear. I mean, in many cases. Some cases are clear, as we will see, but if we go into the more, aspects where sociality plays a role in influence decision making, there it gets a little bit muddy. So, yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. Anyway, so just to wrap that up, my contribution at this moment, I just wanted to underscore that corruption affects security in every context. Obviously, when we're talking about contexts that are already afflicted by conflict and are fragile, corruption is a major obstacle to the building of the type of institutions that are needed to get out of fragility and to ensure that that conflict is prevented. In democratic context, I think that corruption is a major threat to the democratic order, and it goes even beyond, in my opinion, a purely domestic affairs, and even in so-called advanced consolidated democracies, we see the effect that, for example, the dirty fuel lobbies, the industrial food production lobby, having the decisions of the state that prevent more decisive decision-making for adopting greener technologies and for really moving closer to stopping climate change, this is generates security threats that are global. And here we're talking about so-called advanced democratic context. Authoritarian contexts, as I already said are really adept and able to instrumentalize their powers to achieve their goals, and in doing so systematically exclude and repress people. And then also, as will be very clearly highlighted by my colleagues here today, we know that some of the world's nastiest and more authoritarian dictators are out there also use their power through projected in a transnational, transboundary manner to destabilize, promote illegitimate agendas, and ultimately create insecurity for everybody globally. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Claudia, for the big picture. I can see, Ara, you are nodding your head a few times, and I'll obviously ask you to react and maybe bring additional thoughts in. I do want to ask you, though, so the first country, to my knowledge anyway, that has officially designated corruption as a national security threat was the United States a couple of years ago, which had consequences in terms of corruption now being part of the agenda of the National Security Council, which, as you know, is a very decisive body in the US government, in the executive. Can you take why now? Why then? What was their rationale? How did they argue it? How does a country like the US, powerful as it is, decide corruption, which for many is kind of unrelated and soft, be a hardcore security issue?
I thank you for the question. I don't know if the US is the only country that has recognized in history corruption as a security issue. I do know that it's quite unique on this time, on this moment. I know that what they've done is the recognition of fighting corruption as a national security means that also gives a priority for the foreign policy, and that's very unique. My organization, my program, I work in the Defense and Security Program of Transparency International, was created in 2004. And for 20 years, we've been saying this. So I'm happy to see a government catching up in our thinking. And over the years, what we've been doing, so Transparency International is a movement. We have presence in over 100 countries. And what we hear from our colleagues all around the world, from Taiwan, Mexico, Ecuador, Guatemala, South Africa, what we're hearing is that what we learn is that across all countries and across all sectors, corruption is a threat to the state and to societies. And it's mainly because it links to insecurity and instability. So happy to see a country like the US taking that step. Maybe you're asking why now? And this is a mostly peace forum. So if you think of any crisis that you work on, crisis and conflicts, or that you are working on, can you just take a minute, a second, to think of how corruption, what's the role of corruption in the crisis? I know that with the new definition that you just learned, what was the role of corruption? How did corruption contribute to the causes? Once the crisis was on, how corruption enabled the conflict or the crisis going on? And this is most importantly, what I would like to leave you today is going to be my key message. How did corruption worsen or weaken the solutions that you were putting in place? You are a peacebuilding group. How corruption blocked your solution? And that's very important. And then maybe that's why we are very excited to see what the world leaders now are going to say in terms of solutions and elevating corruption at the level of security means that they will have to look at corruption as a central part of their defense strategies, their foreign policy, and not something that often happens, that they see corruption as a very technical issue. Let's solve the problem we have at hand first, which is security, and then we'll think about the other issues. Often with corruption goes gender, human rights, and other issues. No. So we know for many years, we know in transparency, experts know it, and the governments know that corruption has played a role in the causes and impeding the solutions to work. So that's why it's so relevant that as a matter of urgency, we are elevating corruption as a security issue.
Something that, we always say, I think sunshine is the best cure when it comes to corruption, and that what we mean with that is the more transparency, the more accountability, the better we can prevent and fight corruption. But transparency is not necessarily sort of the first and foremost principle when it comes to the defense and security sector for perfectly good reasons in some instances. So if we can't use transparency, or can we nonetheless use transparency to do something about corruption, now more narrowly focused on corruption in the defense sector and the security sector, what has worked? Have you found any tools that have worked a little bit?
We have tools. So first, someone is. So first, thank you for focusing on the solutions. As I said, I think we've been going around talking to governments and different audiences, and often we talk about the problems, and we just need to talk about the solutions and getting them to action because it's urgent now. So transparency is the best tool that you have to tackle corruption. I specifically work on the defense and security sector, which is very, very secretive by nature, but also we make it very secretive. It's our colleagues in Washington that tell us that it's very difficult to see the budget in the Pentagon, even the stationary budget. So it should be the procurement of stationery should not be a national security issue. So that's just an example of how close is this sector. It's a sector that involves a lot of money. In most countries, the budget for security and defense is a lot of money, more than any other budget line. It's a sector that is seen very technical, so very few people get into that. It's a sector that it has a very narrow group of policy decision makers. So the rooms where the decision happen is very close. It's a sector where the oversight, parliamentary civil society is to the max. So that is the perfect recipe to attract corrupt networks, simple as that. So transparency is the best tool that we have to shine a light on potential issues and prevent that use the attraction that have to corrupt or wrongdoers. Other things that have worked is regulate freedom of information standards. What is happening is something that we call defensive exceptionalism. So in countries that have very often access to information or transparency, anti-corruption tools, you see a line and say, with the exception of national security issues. So you see Scandinavian countries and that they are very open, and you see, but no, in national security issues. So that is a blank say. It has to be unpacked. Access to information is another tool that we have in the anti-corruption fighters toolbox. And it's very important to have clear access to information rules And it's not just your freedom of information request that you go to your government and you put a question, what happened with this? Explain. Also, information on procurement, how procurement happened for the stationary, but also for defense equipment. How the budgets, and I work on defense, so what is the defense budget? But I also don't want to see the defense budget, but the actual expenditure, because that's where normally we see that there is a mismatch. They tell you we're going to spend $1 million, and then they spend 2 or 3, and that is not disclosed. So that kind of access to information, arms transfers, what transfer happened. As I said before, putting anti-corruption at the top of the priorities. So in the top documents, that is going to guide. So that's the military doctrine. That's what really goes down into military operations, procurement, planning, is training. But the defense strategies, governments do defense strategies, so like making sure that corruption is there. And that shows political intent to really tackle the issue. But other tools you were talking, I was nodding with climate. I really like that. But tools for climate, fighting the decision of climate is beneficial ownership. Just knowing who are behind these big companies that they are lobbying, who is the beneficiary of that decision your government is making to deploy, to use that and not this sort of thing. That's very important. And money laundering, that's also another issue linked to climate. But the last two that I want to talk about, that is maybe one of the most important tools with transparency that we have in anti-corruption, is whistleblower protection. We cannot do a meaningful oversight without journalists, without civil society, without think tanks, without the whistleblowers. And we need protection. We need people to come forward, the mechanisms that they can do it safely without retaliation.
This is an important point and reminds me of an article recently published in The Guardian, which kind of revealed a major corruption scandal in the operations of UNDP in Iraq, which obviously still is a fragile context.
Yeah.
Not enough information in the article, but the response from UNDP so far has been very, unsatisfactory, because the UN has a very bad history when it comes to whistleblowers. They do not like people to raise their voice and say what they see. And I think, giving them more voice. I just want to, it's a big topic. We have 2 hours. So I do want to bring one more connection or interconnected point in, and that's international weapons trading, legal, illegal, of various shades of gray. What are the connecting points there? Obviously, for security, it's obvious. Where does corruption play a role?
I'm gonna.
You could probably write a PhD thesis.
No, I was going to say, I need to restrain myself because this is my expertise.
Okay.
Arms control is my expertise. The arms trade, traditionally has been said, is the most corrupt of all trades. It's not a surprise. Like, everybody likes the crime story and the arms brokers, arms dealers. It's a very complex trade, per definition. It's intrinsically international, so transboundaries. Is very messy. So you normally just think in a government, you have people from trade, from foreign affairs, from defense, and then you have the customs, you have like transports, you have your DHL that is moving, Air France that is moving the weapons around. So it's really, really messy. The Arms Trade Treaty is the only international rule that regulates the arms trade, and is turning 10 years old this year. So imagine all the years that we have trading arms and weapons around the world, completely unregulated. So it's messy. a lot of money involved, really a lot of money. What I was noting too is the influences. The definition of corruption also is undue influence. What is lobbying and what is an excessive influence? What is the role of arms companies whispering to ministers of defense that what they need for that country is a submarine? We have a country that I won't mention, but it's crisis with the big and in the Big East, that said we don't need this type of equipment. We don't have this type of military expertise. We don't need this very sophisticated type of weapon. We don't know how to use it, but it's still they are getting these weapons because of all the influential power of that starts from the companies. So it's very messy. The Arms Trade Treaty has called states to be transparent, to be responsible, and to be reporting on the type of transfers they're doing. And it's still a baby in terms of international law. So states are still learning on how to do that reporting. We have in my organization an index that is not a perception index, that is one that is looking specifically to the defense institutions and legal systems in place. We learned in the life cycle rating in 2020, we need to do better. It's not a surprise. We learned that many of the major arms exporters are sending weapons to countries that in our index show that they have high to critical risk of corruption in defense institutions. This means that the UK, the US, Germany, Netherlands, Spain are sending weapons to countries that they have not a procurement policy, that the defense strategy or the parliament and defense committee hasn't agreed on that procurement, that they might not have a stockpile management. So it's where you stockpile the weapons, rules and processes in place, or they might not pay the people that they are in charge of those weapons. So it's a responsibility from both suppliers of the weapons and importers of the weapons. But it's also a responsibility for the transport. So the risk of those weapons to be diverted to non-state armed groups or criminal networks is high. So it's a collective responsibility and an interagency responsibility. And I will stop because as I said, I can write a lot.
I probably did write a PhD about this. I'm sure messy is always good for corruption. The messier, the more corruption. I mean, that is clearly the case. The more there is so many intersections with other forms of crime, of course, and illegal trade and so on. I want to turn to you, Olena, if I can now, and perhaps before going right into the discussion of directly current war-related issues, in the specific context of Ukraine, what Claudia and Ara have been describing, is that generally applicable, or how does it resonate with someone who's looked at this defense sector in Ukraine in the specific context?
Definitely. Ukrainians a long time ago have established that corruption is a threat to national security. And this phrase is present in multiple Ukrainian strategic documents long before US recognized it. And according to sociological polls from one year to another for decades now, Ukrainians has always were saying that two main threats to Ukraine is corruption and Russia. Two things. And here at this panel, at this seminar, we actually will discuss how those two are related, because turns out they are related very much, more than people here in Europe, people in Switzerland, people in this region realize. And we in Ukraine, we are on the front line of this battle, and we now realized much more things than before because of this war. And I would like to say also that the feeling I have here in Europe is that people discuss peace, people discuss corruption as if we are now sitting here in Europe in peacetime. But I would argue that Europe is at war, and Europe does not realize it yet, because Russia started waging war on Europe, and Russia and other authoritarian states in general, Russian allies, they have their goal to undermine NATO, undermine EU, undermine European unity. Their associate of Vladimir Putin is writing articles that he wants to establish Russian dominance from Kiev to Lisbon. But on Russian TV every day they discuss how they're going to bomb Berlin, how they're going to destroy London with nuclear strike. But Europeans, they kind of switched off right now. They're not even listening to this anymore. Well, because it doesn't matter, because now Russia is stuck in Ukraine. They are fighting Ukrainians. There will be a long 10-year conflict that will demolish both countries, especially Ukraine, since there are 5 times less people who can fight comparing to Russia in Ukraine. And therefore, Europe sort of is now, I would say, a bit too relaxed about that. But I would argue that right now it is very important to understand that Russia used corruption as a strategic tool, as a statecraft, in order to weaken Ukraine and also soften and weaken Europe and its institutions to prepare for this war. And if you analyze how even the initial plan of Russia was to invade Ukraine, as they said, in 3 days to 3 weeks, the idea of Russia was that Ukraine is so corrupt, and they penetrated into Ukrainian state institutions, in particular security institutions, so much that once Russian tanks will roll over the border, all these Russian agents who are on the payroll, they will wake up and they will say, "Welcome, Russia, we're waiting for you." And all their non-corrupt people, patriotic Ukrainians, will run away to Europe, probably, or will be killed in, some camps and executed. But this calculation, fortunately, about Ukraine was untrue. And Ukraine is actually, even though it has this reputation of being the most corrupt country in Europe, in reality, we as people who work in this field, actually my organization was established with the help of Transparency International Defense and Security in 2016. We realized that how much this narrative is exaggerated. We realized that even corruption perception index, when people in Ukraine are asked about corruption, even their idea of corruption is exaggerated. And this is because Ukraine is very transparent, Ukraine is very democratic, and people talk about corruption maybe too much in Ukraine. And in Ukraine, we have tens of anti-corruption institutions. There is the whole infrastructure: Anti-Corruption National Bureau, Corruption Prevention Agency, High Anti-Corruption Court of Ukraine, my organization, other Anti-Corruption Action Center. We have Transparency International Ukraine. So people are very much aware about corruption risks, but very often when they are asked if they have encountered corruption, they would say, "Oh, I heard this person encountered." And so the perception is exaggerated. That's point one, which I want to make. And point second, which is very important, is that our anti-corruption reforms in Ukraine, including those reforms in defense and security, they were actually much more successful than the world understood. Because the fact that Ukraine is still standing now, second year in this existential, brutal, genocidal war of Russia, full-scale invasion, It means that our institutions are much more resilient and much less corrupt than people thought. And so this is something which my organization has been doing, because we had to explain to different researchers, journalists in these 2 years, that how the reforms prepared Ukrainian defense and security sector for this war. Because this was not studied, this is untold story. Sure.
I didn't want to interrupt you.
No, but yeah.
Thank you so much for your perspective. It's super interesting. And you mentioned how, this conflict is also accelerating the rooting out of corruption out of Ukraine. Do you think it also has an effect on corruption in Russia?
Well, Russia is a completely different state than Ukraine, because Ukraine is a democratic state, and it means our political elites are constantly in competition with each other, and therefore they would use corruption to fight against their opponent, reveal corruption of their opponent in order to come to power. But in Russia, there is no political scene. In Russia, it's authoritarian state. There is only one ruler. It's Vladimir Putin, and he uses corruption as a tool to govern the country. So it's a very different type of corruption. And I think during this war, Russia has maybe even analyze their defense sector. Russia now is on the war footing in terms of their economy. They now relaunched their defense industry production. They also reformed their defense procurement. Basically, Vladimir Putin decided that Russia needs to be prepared and strong for war, not just against Ukraine, against NATO. And if he decides so, then he can say, well, in these sectors, guys, we will not have corruption because this is important for me, because I decided so. And in these other sectors, you can steal and do whatever you want. So now Russia takes defense very seriously. And even though Russian army performed poorly at the beginning of this invasion, right now they learned from their mistakes. They also picked up some technologies that Ukrainians were using against them, like drones, and they started massive production of those drones in Russia. So I wouldn't say that Russian corruption is Russian corruption makes Russian people poor. That's what it does. But Russian corruption means that if the ruler decides that we will be the military aggressive state which will invade all rich Western countries, they will do it. And corruption will not undermine this.
Thank you.
Yeah. And may I continue on their point of strategic corruption? It's a bit what colleagues here were saying, is that in Europe, we study how energy was used to basically make Europe dependent on Russia. We now, for example, maybe you saw recently only the InfoNapalm publication of the hackers of 2018 campaign funded by the Russians, 300 million euro, to basically set up their series of roundtables, media conversations about how Europe cannot survive without Russian gas, how dangerous it is for Europe to transport gas through Ukrainians pipeline. And this whole campaign was supposed to form their opinion and strengthen Russian energy presence in Europe. And 2018 and only published and revealed now. So imagine how many other such campaigns. There was a network of professors in Rome who were on a payroll to say how great Russia is and how Russia can do whatever they want. We have such many stories like this, and I think Europe right now, my main message in this regard would be that they need to be very vigilant and look very carefully, because what is happening in Europe now it's very similar to what was happening in Ukraine prior to their hot war, because Russia was trying to buy Ukraine. Russia was trying to penetrate. Russia was trying to disinform. And when all that, and then Russia was emboldened and became impatient and
That's what they're
decided
doing in Africa as well.
to invade. Yes. In Africa, they do the same, of course, globally. And not only Russia, but other authoritarian states, Iran, China, North Korea. But Russia, I would say they are the masters of corruption as a state corrupt, as strategic corruption. They are number one in the world. So we have to watch for that.
Yeah. Allow me, I will come back to you because I do want to, I mean, I really want to just stress what you said, Olena. I think one of the things that I keep being asked about is like, how bad is corruption in Ukraine? And I always have to say, tell the same story. We've worked there for 10 years. I can tell you, compared to most other countries in which I work, there is actually a lot more serious progress. So that's one of the stories I think that we have to demystify it a little bit, because it also impacts how the European Union and others would support Ukraine or not with funding. The other one I think that I want to come back to you on this one later is it's hard to imagine how incredibly engaged civil society can be in a country that's in the middle of war, including in a sector that's so, secretive as defense. But I do want to bring in Martin because the connection is obviously, really important. And as I said, you've co-authored the Kremlin playbook. So what can you tell us what the game that they play in the Kremlin, and of course it's not a game, what it is in the region and perhaps beyond as well?
Thank you, Greta, and thank you for inviting me to this very interesting panel. It's great to see you all here, and especially Olena, who was my professor in 2008 in university in New York. So it's great to reconnect.
It was the other Olena.
Yeah, but I think many of the things that we discussed in 2008 have not been overcome as issues. We are still living in a very similar world in a way. And it's great that you mentioned how Russia is using corruption to yield influence around the world. And I'll elaborate on that, putting my other hat. Greta presented me as the Director of Energy and Climate Program, but I have been working for the last decade or so on mapping Russian economic influence all across Europe. And I'd love to put some slides just to visualize some of the work that we have done recently. And I just want to also make a short comment on corruption perceptions in Ukraine. I fully agree that this kind of narrative about how Ukraine is the most corrupt country in Europe has been fed also by the Russians to Germans and other countries in Europe as to present Ukraine more as an obstacle to good ties between Russia and Europe rather than a part of the kind of the security architecture. And it was very well received in Berlin, I would say, this kind of narrative. And we've been briefing the German Foreign Ministry for years and years. They actually invited us, buying tickets, booking the hotels, supposedly so that we brief them on Russian economic influence in Europe. But it wasn't a briefing, it was a shouting match in which the Germans were trying to convince us that, the Russians are actually not strategic about their gas projects. This is just business, has nothing to do with politics, and Ukraine is so corrupt, so we need to circumvent Ukraine because we cannot do gas business in Ukraine. So this was the narrative that was, to be honest, until 1st of February, the main narrative in Europe. And I will be supposedly we're in Chatham household, but I would say that Western European capitals were kind of prepared for a surrender of Ukraine. The Germans didn't wait for 4 days before making a first official statement on the situation in Ukraine. I think Berlin, but not only Berlin, Rome as well, and Vienna, not to mention, they were waiting for Ukraine to surrender so that they kind of reframe the strategic cooperation with Russia in a new setting, find a BS excuse to keep on doing business. Sorry for this, but I've been so involved in that of course, not as much as the Ukrainian organizations, but this is really a time to say, we told you so. And Switzerland is also one of the big enablers, and I'll focus also on the role that European countries have played in helping Russia invade Ukraine in a way. So moving on a slide. And by the way, the perception, it's important. Perception is not actual state of corruption. CSD has been working for the last 3 decades also on corruption measurement. We have a system called CMS, called Corruption Monitoring System, and it's based on victimization. Sometimes it's important to ask people whether they have actually experienced corruption on the ground. It's based on anonymous surveys. What happens often is that if you have more than 5% of corruption victimization, so basically institutions having asked people to give bribes in more than 5% of their transactions meaning you go to the hospital, you want to like get treatment, or you want to sign your kid into school and you need and the school director is asking you for a bribe. These kind of transactions, if they're more than 5%, basically corruption perception in society gets to more than 90%. Why? Because after 5%, you always know someone that have been engaged in a corruption transaction. So it's much more, as Ulena mentioned, people always talk about it and they know someone that have been engaged in that. So their perception is, all right, it's a very corrupt place. So, but this doesn't really mean that all transactions are corrupt, or the corruption is widespread, etc. Moving on to Russia, and maybe one slide before. Moving on to the Kremlin playbook and the Russia's use of strategic corruption. We try to see what is the share of the economy that Russia has captured over the last 20 years in different European countries. Now we have covered all of Europe. And we have tried to compare and contrast the different mechanisms for economic influence and how this economic influence translates into political leverage. Now we're going global because after the Russian invasion in Ukraine, Russia has reoriented a lot of its economic and strategic corruption activities outside of Europe. So we're doing Latin America and hopefully Africa soon as well. Next slide. This slide shows the main mechanism under which we're trying to understand the Kremlin playbook and what strategic corruption means as an instrument of foreign policy. We call it the unvirtuous cycle of state capture, in which basically starts back in Russia. Over the last 2 decades and more, we have seen a fusion of economic and political interests in Russia, whereas basically private entities, private companies are no longer independent from the Kremlin. More than 80% of the Russian economy is right now state-owned or directly dependent on the state. And even the so-called private oligarchs, they all depend on the Kremlin for support. Without the Kremlin support, their businesses in Russia or across the world are exposed. And Vladimir Putin has created a mechanism in which all of these private interests can be weaponized. So when oligarchic networks expand their presence in terms of business interests, in terms of buying assets, in terms of doing joint ventures with European companies, let's say, or other entities, these oligarchic networks are doing business to make profit, of course, but at any point of time, they can be used by the Kremlin in order to yield political influence. Why? Because otherwise they might be expropriated back in Russia, they can be put in prison, they can be forced out. And we have seen over the last 2 decades on a multiple occasions. I mean, I could, from the top of my head, I can think of 10 different large Russian oligarchs that have been basically pressured with fake court cases and expropriations in Russia to basically stand behind the Kremlin's foreign and strategic policy. So this kind of state capture within Russia is then translated in Europe, whereas Russian oligarchic networks basically connect with local domestic state capture networks, the local oligarchs, and they create something called a partnership of crime, in a way. Whereas the Russian oligarchs and the local European oligarchs, they find a common objective, which could be taking over strategic sector, expanding market share, developing a strategic project, gas pipeline, refinery, bank, telecom, you name it. And how is that happening? Well, the local domestic oligarchic networks have the ear of the political elite and can use their influence over the local political elite to basically capture strategic decision-making of institutions such as regulators, ministries, central banks, etc. Why is it becoming a circle? Once the initial kind of mission or the initial objective has been achieved, this provides this oligarchic network on both sides with a lot more economic resources and also political kind of power to entrench further these networks and expand them in other sectors. So this becomes kind of a virus that slowly expands throughout the economy and throughout the political elite. What happens is that in the end, you have a very intricate patronage network that might not be visible on the surface. Let's not forget that Russia is not a big economic power. But because this patronage network goes into strategic areas, its influence over long-term decision-making on foreign policy, on sanctions, on diversification of supply, you name it, on illicit finance, on money laundering policies, etc., becomes really, really important. So this patronage is able to influence this decision-making. Next slide, please. So this is our latest overview of the Russian economic influence on the eve of the invasion in Ukraine. It shows the corporate footprint that the Russian companies have across Europe. So the amount of revenues that Russia-owned companies have made in different countries. It basically follows not only directly Russian-owned companies, but also entities that are nominally owned by entities within the Netherlands, Cyprus, Austria, Switzerland, but actually have ultimate beneficial ownership located in Russia. So we have done a deep assessment of corporate ownership networks and the ways Russia has obfuscated, has hidden the ownership network. As you can see, there are roughly $350 billion of revenues generated by Russian-owned companies. In Europe, we estimate that since 1990, a total of 1 trillion euros have moved from Russia or from then Soviet Union to Europe. Most of this money have gone into conspicuous consumption. That's not to mention, so real estate, yachts, etc. But of course, you cannot really spend so much money on yachts. A lot of the money have gone into strategic partnership with national champions. The Shell, Eni, OMV, Intersect in Germany, EDF, Total, I can go on and on, BP. These strategic partnerships have been based on mutual profits, mutual benefits. And because national European champions have such an important role to play within governments, they usually stay within stateless. Let's just think about what is the role of Shell in the Netherlands. It's incredible, or OMV in Austria. They have pushed national governments to be soft on Russia. And this has enabled Russia to become more and more assertive in Ukraine, not only by circumventing. This story of circumventing Ukraine, it's becoming banal already. This is not the only way Ukraine has been pressured over the years before the invasion. It was a constant kind of Russian lobbying through national champions, through national business and political networks, to push central governments not to be aggressive towards Russia's positions in Ukraine. This is an old story. So what happens? 2 years in the war, we have had a tremendous response from Europe, very unprecedented, very surprising. Europe has indeed implemented a significant amount of sanctions. Please, next slide. Yes,
Just one question. Do you have the background data of the conflicts?
of course.
Is that available? Because I would be interested in that.
It's actually, we made an interactive tool online, which I can share with you later, where you can check all the data. So this graph shows what happens after the invasion in Europe in terms of rational companies. As you see, out of 45,000 companies that we identified within Europe, which are owned by Russia, around 10% have been under one or another sanction. This is not only Russian invasion sanctions, these are sanctions related to other corruption cases or money laundering charges, etc. And as you can see, Germany is probably the most vulnerable place with more than above 500 companies that have been under sanctions. The problem is that after this initial wave of trying to kind of sever ties with Russian oligarchic networks, we have been very slow to enforce these sanctions. Very few countries have been actually taking measure of kicking out some of these companies out of their economies. This again, Chatham House, after discussions that we have had with sanctions officials both in the EU and the US, we know that roughly half of the EU countries have not done anything on enforcing sanctions. Including my own country, Bulgaria, unfortunately. It has not sanctioned a single company, although we have identified 4,000 Russian companies in Bulgaria. Actually, the national authorities have identified only 100, which means that they don't even have the capacity to identify all the Russian entities within the country, not to mention sanction them. So enforcement has been very slow. This has allowed Russia and Russian oligarch networks over the last 2 years to consistently invent schemes to circumvent sanctions, and most importantly, to sever ties with the Kremlin. So many of these companies have transferred ownership to other nominal representatives and owners. Switzerland is a case where you have many companies transferring ownership from one party to another on a regular basis in order to hide the origin of the capital. Austria is doing similar thing now. Raiffeisen Bank, biggest bank in the country, is undergoing a scheme in which to get Oleg Deripaska, one of the closest oligarchs to Putin, to save his 25% share into one of the largest construction companies in Europe, Strabag, so which is preposterous, and this is being done in broad daylight. Not to mention oil and gas flows, which have continued. Of course, Europe has banned oil imports, and a lot of the revenue that Russia was making from selling oil and oil products to Europe has gone down. But there's so many loopholes in this oil sanctions regime that we estimated between 20 and 25% of the oil products that Europe consumes today are also from Russian origin. They're being re-exported, or some countries in Europe, like Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Hungary, and Slovakia, have a derogation and keep on importing Russian crude oil into Europe. So we are still not there. And what we have advocated for the past 2 years is that we need an economic security policy on a global level, which was main objective. Number one objective is strategic decoupling from Russia. Strategic decoupling doesn't mean sanctions only. It means basically stopping any kind of economic relationship with Russia at the moment. Everything else means financing the war effort. And as you can see, Russia is very much able to finance its activities. Let me give you just one example. I'm sorry that I have to pinpoint Bulgaria again for that. Bulgaria has imported, just over the last year, so 2023, has imported Russian crude oil equaling $2.2 billion. This revenue that was generated for the Kremlin, we estimate to have financed the acquisition of at least 1,500 missiles. One missile can maybe kill 10 people. So imagine how many people have been killed by just the oil trade with Bulgaria, one of the smallest consumers of oil. It's now the fourth largest importer of Russian crude oil in the world. So these kind of obvious glaring loopholes have to be first stopped, but then we need an economic security strategy that builds on two main elements. One is full sanctions enforcement based on significant capacity building of local institutions, financial intelligence units, energy regulators, antitrust bodies, central banks, so that they follow much closely illicit financial flows. And then we need a constructive capital, constructive economic security strategy where we need to tackle economic footprint with economic footprint. So in order to force out the Russian oligarch networks out of these countries, you need alternatives. So this means Western capital going into strategic sectors, especially in Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe, where the left, Russia leaving out leaves a huge gap into strategic sectors, which can be filled out by other cronies, other authoritarian countries, or other local oligarch networks. This can be stopped if there is a more kind of consistent strategy on countering. Yes.
Are there examples of Western capital working already that way? In the last 18 months?
Not to my knowledge, to be honest.
The main threat or the main problem is that India and China, which strongly increased import of Russian oil. So, and through each product we buy from India and Russia, in fact, we indirectly support.
That's exactly what I mean. So Europe buys crude oil products, so gasoline, diesel, naphtha, fuel oil, buy them from Turkey. So Turkey is the second largest refiner of Russian crude oil, from India, from Morocco, Egypt, China, not so much, I would say. But these refined products, Europe knows very well where they're coming from and how have they been produced.
But also the industrial products, because they're produced with Russian oil in China and India and are exported to Europe.
That's also, yeah, of course, this is also an important piece of the puzzle. The whole supply chain has not really changed. It has been diverted, not to mention, goods trade, how basically European goods have kept on moving to Russia through third countries, ex-Soviet countries, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Turkey, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, etc. And we have not done anything to stop these flows. Part of the reason is that really, as I mentioned, there is not enough administrative capacity in many of these institutions. And this is not recognized as a strategic problem from top down, so that there is really an effort to streamline the process of strategic decoupling. So yeah.
Elena wanted to comment on something as
Yeah.
well, so we can be a bit more free flowing, but.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to comment that indeed it is true that Europe indirectly right now keeps sending money to Russia to fund this war. And we understand, yes, through third countries, but which is even more critical, in my opinion, matter, which we should say it. European technology in Western weapons. Western technology in Western weapons. Like, I want to ask you a question. Like, what was their percentage by which this share of Western technology was reduced? Their export was reduced from 2022 to 23. What do you think? How much the West was able to curb their export to Russia to build weapons? By how much? By how many percent?
But
Okay, 9. But still,
How do you measure this?
This 9%, what's the base?
It's the report of our partners, Kiev School of Economics. We basically receive their lists of components from all weapons that we intercept in Ukraine, missiles, Russian planes, everything. And we look at component when it was produced, by which company. And we also look at the supply chains through export databases, through trade databases. And then we can see that in that year, those technologies were exported for this amount of money. And in that year, it was reduced. So it's all traceable. And on the website of my organization, we have a number of reports about this matter. And guess which country is number one in Europe in terms of supplying critical tech to Russian weapons?
Switzerland?
It's Switzerland. So Switzerland gives weapon to Russia to kill Ukrainians, bluntly speaking. And Switzerland is a neutral, peaceful country. And Switzerland doesn't even allow transfer of weapons. They didn't even agree to give their decommissioned weapon to Germany, so they pass it to us to protect our lives. But at the same time, what we studied about Switzerland is that there are companies in Switzerland that directly were trading with Russian defense manufacturers until 1 year ago. And that's because the Swiss government just didn't sanction those Russian defense companies because they are slow and they are catching up. And they did not.
We hope they're catching up. It's not sure.
Yeah, so it's something which is, what Martin was talking about, this strategic decoupling. It's a huge effort. And Russia has been working on this for years. And I was present at the meetings also in Germany, from German and Ukrainian delegations, where Ukrainians were saying to Germans that if you allow Nord Stream 2, it means there will be a war in Europe, that Russia, after you become so dependent on, they will not be afraid and they will have war. And this is what happened. So, but now, same thing with this critical technology. Europeans keep selling to Russia because they are not afraid that this technology will be used against them to bomb their cities. It may happen in several years from now.
Can you tell what technology is it? Is it IT? Is it software? Or what is it?
Yes, of course. These are semiconductors, microchips, navigation modules, CNC machines. From Germany especially, these are huge equipment which are used to produce weapons. So this technology, but to basically give you some positive news, I don't know if it's positive, is that comparing, of course, to United States, European share of those technology is very small in Russian weapon because majority of technology in Russian weapon comes from the United States.
Doesn't make us feel any better, of course.
I
appreciate it, but we shouldn't think like that, of course. But it's appreciated. We have another question coming in here, please.
Yes, it's a question to Ara, maybe or Lena, and it's about engaging youth in these because we have big youth actions, campaigns, energy on climate, on peace, on human rights, but hardly ever any engagement on anti-corruption. Although tomorrow at the Pacey Awards, which is the youth awards event that's a side event to Basel Peace Forum, we do have one youth project on anti-corruption as one of the finalists, the Corruption Tracker. So there's starting to be an edge. But how can we get more youth engagement in these activities and seeing the connections of corruption to these other critical issues they're working on, climate, peace, human rights?
Let me deviate from my script a little bit, and actually, because I think we will eventually come back to the Kremlin playbook, but I do want to just mention, I think Martin and Olena, the key point here is really that it's maybe almost simplified, apologies for saying that, to call it the Kremlin playbook, because it's not the Kremlin alone. He has a huge amount of enablers, and we are all part of that. And I think that's sort of the main message, is the Kremlin playbook, but he's playing us like chess figures very, very brilliantly. But I do want to actually pick your contribution, if I can, to move us I'm not saying we shouldn't continue to talk about the Kremlin playbook and the war in Ukraine because it's so absolutely existential. But we do have sort of maybe also for your, I can't imagine necessarily always what your job entails, but I'm thinking you work in fragile contexts also outside of immediate war zones potentially. And Claudia, I do want to bring us back maybe to the different levels of corruption, not only strategic corruption. How can we even do anti-corruption in a fragile context? And I do think that some of the people who work in these contexts would like to know that, because I think, Ara, you said at the beginning, we usually, the tendency, and we've seen it in many countries, is let's solve the fragility first, and then we can talk about corruption. Can anti-corruption even be, can it be done in a country like, let me say, Mali, or I'm not going to say Sudan, that's too extreme perhaps, but, how? And maybe youth plays a role? I don't know.
I think Ara already started getting us in that direction, in that, peacemakers should not relegate corruption as an afterthought, because we know very well that, unfortunately, corruption can be a currency by means of which to co-opt, conflicting factions, to pacify. But then the problem is that you are ingraining the corruption in the system, and then you develop these repertoires, these playbooks of corruption being part of the system that are really, really difficult to get rid of. I mean, Putin's power and his ability to deploy, this strategy that Martin has been describing is not coming from a vacuum, right? This has been inherited, and these are systems that have been built. So I think that it's really important for donors and the community involved to really put a priority to working on anti-corruption. But here is the caveat: it has to be done sensibly and strategically, because it's also the case, and we know this very well, that the risk, and this is what many donors, their caveats come from, is what if our efforts, our money is instrumentalized for political purposes? So I think that as donors, as stakeholders, it's very important to think and work politically, to know which, red flags there are, and we know this at our institute because we work very closely with law enforcement. So we know when our efforts are being, taken up and actually yielding results. And we also know when, the training is going, the capacity is going, the evidence is unfolded and nothing happens. There are ways to identify the red flags. Can I say something quickly about the youth? Because I think that, I agree with you, and youth are our hope. By all means, they are energized and they get very angry about injustice, and they are also capable to go out and mobilize. But I think that, not to exclude the power that has, but I think it's very important to try to channel the energy of youth, especially in countries like Switzerland, through democratic mechanisms, and this is an argument that I've been making also outside of Switzerland, in other countries that have more, growing or consolidating democracies, that it's really important for youth to take because everybody pretty much around the world gets the civic education in the classroom, right? About what being a good citizen and what you should not do and what corruption is. And then with the same mind, we know that things happen differently outside. I'm Mexican, so I grew up with this ambivalence in my youth. And I think it's very important for young people to know that they can take this, that they can have learned in the classroom and use it, where there are democratic instruments of participation, of decision-making, of initiating a petition, a referendum, whatever. I think this is where we should help and enable youth make use of these mechanisms, because honestly, political elites everywhere, what they care about is getting re-elected, and the youth can vote. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Can I add
on Martin and then Ara as well, I think, right? or yeah, go ahead quickly.
Yeah, thank you. Just quickly, I want to say that during their wartime, since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, Ukrainian society, including the youth, they have mobilized and they have been activated like never before. And one of the things was actually fighting corruption, because when before the full-scale invasion, everybody said that corruption, yes, is a threat to national security. Now they just say corruption kills, because corruption during war is so dangerous, and the level of tolerance to corruption in Ukraine has decreased so much. And right now, our officials, even during the war, they are under so much scrutiny and they are under so much criticism, because our whole nation now is engaged in a war where we have all now family members and friends who died on the front line. Therefore, now everybody, including very much young generation, they say, look, I will be now monitoring procurement of food for the army. I want to make sure that they didn't procure expensive eggs, that they procured eggs at their good market price. And we see now there is like a surge, there is like a renaissance of all these people who are so active. It's amazing. And now their civic council, anti-corruption council, was created at the Ministry of Defense. Now, if you come to the Ministry of Defense, you'll see a lot of young people, like, you know, they look like hipsters. They are hipsters, and they are trying to solve Ukrainian defense there. And the ministry said, okay, welcome, come. We are a little bit worried about state secrecy, but okay, well, you are Ukrainian, so we'll let you do it. And sometimes even in conversations, we have meetings where officials would say something, but then we realize it was actually a state secret. But okay, but this is how democracy works. Society wants to save the country, and people step up. And young people in Ukraine are indeed amazing in this regard. Yeah,
I wish I had any civic education at school. I'm just going to say I hope the younger generation does. I've never learned about anything to do with being citizens of, let alone corruption. The other question, then we come back to Martin and also Art.
Thanks a lot. Thanks to all of you. It's really super interesting. I come from the transitional justice, dealing with the past field. So corruption is part of our framework, but kind of very limited. And in this institutional reforms part that comes, you know, after we do the transition and we build institutions and so on, right? And I've worked a lot on Peru. I'm from Peru, worked a lot on Peru. I know you have too. And so I see now, and I guess it's the case for many other contexts too, that we're circling back to kind of the same situation maybe 20, 30 years ago. And I see as one of the main reasons corruption, massive, really systematic corruption. And I see two fields that I was wondering what you have observed. On the one hand, the aspect of vetting, lustration and vetting, and taking out of decision-making positions, both in security sector, but also other democratic institutions, those people that are already and have already been connected to corruption. As I see those same elites, you know, still having the power. But then also maybe connecting to the youth question, the role of education. I mean, you mentioned it a bit. I'm not so sure about if we all learn about it in school or if we are so totally disconnected to reality afterwards, because now we should have a new generation in Peru, and they're still the same corrupt or worse corrupt than before. So yeah, I asked myself, like, we've done so much and we're at the same place or worse. So what went wrong?
I think Peru is one of the only countries which has 5 out of 6 former presidents in prison, at least. So
yes, I always like to celebrate that as a positive thing myself.
But it's, yeah,
it's hard to celebrate it.
I'm not even sure. I know, Martin, you've been wanting to come in, and we'll come back to your question. Everyone's
maybe it's a bit of a joke kind of comment on youth a little bit. You know, Gen Zs, they really like to complain about how rich people are exploiting them and how they're getting all the spoils. Well, maybe this is one way to talk about strategic corruption. It's about following the money. It's about who gets the money. It's not about power politics. You know, because when we talk about Russia as, you know, an empire that tries to recover its lost territories from the Soviet Union, etc., we kind of rationalize why they're doing things. Now, the Kremlin regime is a group of bandits that want to make a lot of money. You know why Europe is not sanctioning LNG imports? Because Russian LNG imports are skyrocketing. There is one simple reason. Because the LNG company that exports LNG from Russia to Europe, Novatek, has been doing that in a partnership with Total, the French giant. And the owner of Novatek, with the majority shareholder, Gennady Timchenko, he is exempted from paying taxes in Russia. Any taxes on extraction of gas, on export duties. And Europe said, oh, well, we're not financing the Kremlin. Total is winning. Novatek is this good Russian oligarch. So it's about making money on both sides, Europe and Russia. And the youth is going to get mad about how they cannot get jobs and how they're making very low salaries while these guys are making these corrupt deals that actually enable the war in Ukraine. So this kind of narrative could be activated, I think, with the youth a little bit more. And we should bring these people to Zug. Is Zug close to Basel?
Close enough, yeah, close enough.
Because Zug, you have 90% of the Russian entities incorporated.
Bulgaria is an example for how many days did the Bulgarians take to the street in order to protesting against corruption to get a different government to how many? It was more than a year or something like that.
Yeah.
That you had street protests. So, not that
most people were really
upset about it. Claudia, Ara, do you want to come in at this point? I do want Ara also to speak about what you referred to in terms of transitional justice. Let's make peace first and then look at corruption second, because I think you have some thoughts on Afghanistan. Maybe we'll take one more question and then I'll let you react to the different points that were raised.
I have a small, big question. And that is the expansion of the BRICS and its relation to world corruption.
Claudia, Ara, you've been under speaking so far. I do want you to come in on whichever points you want.
I had so many. I had something on youth. I would mention something on Carnegie has a nice tool that I often refer to. It's a map of the protests around the world, and you can check by words or what is the reason why people are protesting. And I often go there and I put corruption, and you see across the world, months, weeks, people in the street, including youth. So this is something that is relevant. But I think one message that I've been trying to say today is that you need to embed it. So this is a peace forum. We are not doing a very good job, and especially in the last years. It doesn't look good. So we have wicked problems, and we keep coming to them with just one lens, just one side. Each of us, transitional justice, anti-corruption, peace, human rights. Don't touch human rights. Don't do different things. It's just ridiculous. We need holistic approaches to the very big problems we have, and that includes the climate, the trade, the corporate power. Holistic approaches. That's my thing. But I do have thoughts on the question that you said about very fragile states like Mali, and it's not only we can do anti-corruption work, is that we really must do anti-corruption work. And I really wanted to mention Afghanistan because it's sadly a cautionary tale of everything that my organization is doing, has been working on it 20 years. It's just the playbook of how ignoring and putting anti-corruption in the back burner can really lead to mission failure. So it's such a complex case There were multiple issues. There were the security concerns took precedence at all points. So we had to fight the incidents. We had to secure this place. Forgetting everything else, there was a fundamental lack of understanding on the context and Afghanistan. There was unrealistic timeframes that were put by the US on how much will it take to rebuild a country. And that unrealistic timeframes where they were not meeting, they were trying to solve, we tried to solve them, putting more money and then having contractors and putting money in a country with no governance. Different agencies and bodies were not talking to each other. So fundamental lack of communication. So even if an agency identify an obstacle, were not communicated, that was the obstacle. And the example that I have, and this is very complex, is that we have private security contractors, US private security contractors, who were paid to protect the US Department of Defense and USA assets. So the private contractors paid by the US, and the private contractors put a lot of the money because they didn't have their time frames and the resources to pay the insurgents, not to attack the assets. Mm-hmm. So this made de facto the Taliban or the insurgents an unofficial subcontractor of the US government. Mm-hmm. And this was said, we have Transparency International has an office in Afghanistan. We did reports announcing this. People knew about this. So, and I think they didn't take action. Just they didn't take action. With the betting, and really want to go, it's like we've seen often that the security concern and the peace concern takes prevalence. And this is a clear example. You go to the mediated peace settlements, and you want to have, I'm not a mediator, but I think that you want to have everyone that is a voice of power around the table, including the warlords, including those that have been causing lots of problem. You have them around the table. And the warlords, often, you give them the Ministry of Natural Resources. This happens in many countries around the world, which is gonna lead to that links to the gas, the climate, the powers, and perpetuating corruption. That country won't have a chance of stability. They won't have a chance. Maybe you won't have the conflict that you have at the original conflict, but you have multiple others. Society won't have a chance. So you must put corruption as a central, even in fragile states.
Claudia, did you come in? Otherwise, Martin has we had a question.
Maybe I can say something about education, since you called the vetting part of the question. And I'm not going to be the one speaking publicly against education by any means, but it is not enough to teach children what corruption is, why it's bad, that they should refrain, because in many cases, unfortunately, people see corruption as problem solving. So let me give you the case of my country. We have armies of young people who feel they have no chance at getting decent jobs to make a living, and they see the drug cartel people becoming millionaires, driving the fancy cars, getting the women with little effort. Mm-hmm. So we need a proof of concept why anti-corruption can also be problem solving. And this is why I think, for me, I mean, maybe other people have other ideas, but for me, the clearer way is to use the formal legal mechanisms that there exist and have them exercise, in practice, demand, make the politicians uncomfortable and get results, and I even pitched once, I'm still pushing for it, a program, get the little children even, to organize themselves, write letters just to get improvement in their local park. It can start small, but I think that we need that proof of concept that if we organize, if we exercise voice, call people to account, use the legal tools that our democracies, even if they are mostly on paper, offer us, I think this is the way to really change the mindset.
And can I, thank you, can I add just a little bit to this? It's very important for these young people in any country, in Mexico or in Ukraine, to basically create a public culture that saying that if this other young person is driving a Lamborghini, but this car was acquired through corrupt actions, then I don't approve of that. It's not cool, and it's very important to because unfortunately in many of our countries, but even here, like in Europe, Swiss people don't ask where those fancy cars that Russians or other are driving here in Europe, but it should be this culture. And in Ukraine, we're trying to create this culture now because young people, and Martin said it correctly, and you said it correctly, they want to have nice things. And then if one young person has it, another doesn't, they shouldn't say you are so cool because you have it.
This is where the opportunity is. We saw it in Rwanda after the genocide. Now we look at Rwanda, Kagame, who was a general. Anyway.
Yeah, so it's a change of
violence.
Culture. We need to talk about, and that's what we're trying to establish in Ukraine when we talk about this civilian.
Martin, you've been itching to come in as well, and then we have another question.
No, I just wanted to kind of continue Ara's comment on the link between corruption and security, especially in the framework of Russian economic influence around the world. The Kremlin playbook is not very creative. They kind of emulate a certain approach, and one of it is to kind of link up the security of a country, especially a fragile country, with exploitation of public resources or natural resources. And in Africa, we have seen that very clearly. So what Russia has been trying to do using Wagner as a tool is to provide security guarantees to authoritarian leaders who cannot really keep control over the territory of their country in exchange for getting priority access to resources. We've seen that in Sudan, in Central African Republic, in Mozambique, in Angola, etc. So, of course, the level of security engagement is different in different countries, but the pattern is similar. And you know where this was invented? It wasn't in Africa, it wasn't Wagner, it wasn't even in Africa, partially also in Donbass, I would say, after 2014. But it was very much kind of put on a national level in Armenia. Armenia, for years and years, expected that Russia would provide a security guarantee on the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict with Azerbaijan. And Armenians were happy to host a Russian army on their territory. And Russia said, okay, that's great. We keep Nagorno-Karabakh for you guys, and we're going to protect your sovereignty and security. So now transfer all assets of your major companies, telecoms, gas, power, utilities, nuclear, to the Ministry of Defense. The Ministry of Defense becomes the owner of the most important assets in the country. And guess what the Ministry of Defense does? It sells privatized assets in the hands of the biggest Russian state-owned companies, banks, electricity. So this kind of securitization of economic assets is a very, very nice trick that the Russians use.
Martin, I need to ask you to stay speaking, please, because we have big, small BRICS state expansion question. And one of the things we spoke about as well is why is only the Kremlin playing this playbook, or are others coming on board? I think earlier we spoke about China, India. What's their playbook? How does it compare? And maybe that's the BRICS response to an extent.
Well, I think BRICS has two phases. One is the PR image, so an alternative international order, which is a beneficial narrative for all members of BRICS, that they can stand up to kind of the West. But I think this doesn't have substance. So the other phase of BRICS is that basically you're dealing with countries that have many conflicts among each other. India and China hate each other. Russia and China in a very toxic relationship in which basically Russia is becoming a surrogate, natural resource surrogate to China. South Africa is supporting Russia, but but otherwise they don't really have anything to. So we should differentiate substance from PR, but PR is very important because unfortunately the West very often forms its economic, foreign and strategic policy based on perceptions rather than substance, and so we overreact to things, and that's exactly what Russia and China want. They want the West to overreact so that they have a motivation to keep on tucking away, influence in different parts of the world. And I think China is very much emulating Russia's model of behavior in many parts. They're learning from the Kremlin playbook, and they're trying to back this playbook with a lot of resources, much bigger resources than Russia. I think China is not that successful in that sense, because they don't know how to operate the local state capture networks. In a way, we saw that in Europe. China tried to enter Europe in a very aggressive way economically by basically buying up countries. That was the mentality that they have acquired from dealing with Africa or with Southeast Asia. Well, it doesn't work like that in Europe. In Europe, you need to buy influence using the cronies of the central governments in power. You need to use corruption. But like the president or the prime minister of a country in Europe very often is not a single decision maker that can actually push through things. He needs to work with a web of actors around him. And I think China doesn't still understand this game very well, in my opinion. So we'll see what happens with China. China has a lot of resources, so China can become more strategic in the future. Yeah.
I asked about the expansion of BRICS.
Oh, the expansion of BRICS.
Yes. Because there's a proposition of, Europe.
Well, Saudi Arabia or Argentina,
Iran.
I mean, these countries try to find a wing under which to cover, in a way, to cover the fact that they're trying to do illicit business with different actors. So they want to make sure that they are part of an international forum where they feel more secure about that. So I think we shouldn't exaggerate the role of this expansion of BRICS.
But okay, we have two more questions, and then I knew 2 hours would never be enough, but it's the start of a conversation. So, we'll take quickly two questions. I know, Olena, you want to react to something, but we'll also do a quick closing round, perhaps, sort of like, what more can we do so that we do better what Ara said we're not doing very well? So just gentleman in the blue shirt, and then in the front, and then we'll come to the conclusion. Sir?
We have 40 persons in this group.
Yes. Okay. Good.
There are 10 minutes left. How many seconds for every person?
I don't.
I'll take 1 or 2 minutes. Stick my comment. 2 or 3 of you will think, why didn't I take the words? This is freedom of expression democracy. I practice it daily. There's a lot of non-violence. Not only non-violence and anti-corruption. There is also positive things. I heard a few things about education. Did I hear anybody talk about honesty here? Maybe not. I wasn't paying full attention full time. Did I hear about a human-based economy? The economy is mainly changing, and the anti-corruption movement needs to go and say a lot louder where they want this money to go. Is it social and economical rights? Universal basic income, maybe? This is really giving the money back to the people. Thanks. Non-violence, again, we all travel, or at least I guess in this group. We might all be confronted with corruption cases. Education again. There is another thing. I believe in example, and this is a dirty question. I want you to know or to express in 1 minute or two, how do you keep your hands clean when working on such a dirty business? Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. There's a lot you refer to, which I usually say it's all got to do with the broken social contract. I don't know if we ever had a contrat social, but ultimately it's a lot of that, I think. We have one more question here and then the closing. I mean, you're more than welcome, every 40 people in here, to have your 30 seconds of saying something. Otherwise, I'll focus on the panelists, but truly, if you have like a brilliant idea of how peace building and anti-corruption can work more closely together, don't hesitate to come in. Last question.
It's more in the same direction because it's not only us Europeans or the evil Russians who are the problem. The British and the French in the 18th and especially 19th century were splitting the Near East and created the situation we have today. So it's an old pattern we have over the centuries. And my question is, how can we contribute to overcome these conflict zones? That's the tricky, the very, very difficult thing, because if it goes on like this, if Europe and Russia will be split in two parts for the next 50 years, our grandchildren all over will suffer terribly. So I do not have the answer, but I see history is repeating itself. We see what we have seen 250 years ago. My question is, what can we do about it?
Yeah, sometimes when I ask myself the question after a long hard work day, I feel like maybe I should just go and sell newspapers at the kiosk or something. It'd be really less stressful, but it wouldn't change the world either. Can we change the world? Who knows? The challenges are enormous. I mean, I think the panelists are outstanding in bringing it back to us. Also connecting the dots. How can we better connect the dots at least? Because I do think like a lot of what I hear is like, we need to bring in youth. We need to bring in the environment people. I mean, already people in this room need to work more. And this is the first time I'm talking to a peace, the first time we're having an event with a crowd of peace negotiators, peace advocates, whatever. God, we should have had that 20 years ago and we tried, right? But so final words of wisdom, where do we take this? How to get out of this conundrum?
Starting with me?
Why not? You came last.
It's about us. It's about countries, institutions, and strengthening governance. There are multiple deficits within our institutional frameworks all across Europe, which need to be fixed. There is kind of democratic erosion of institutions all across Europe. I think this is part of the reason for that is complacency. We are so used to institutions working like Swiss clockwork. But even today we started 10 minutes late in Switzerland. So I'm joking.
The world's falling apart.
The world is falling apart. So, yeah. So I mean, there is. We need to go back to the basics and not take things for granted. And I feel like authoritarian countries, including Russia, are trying to take advantage of these loopholes in order to use them, as in judo, our weaknesses for their benefit. This is why probably Putin likes this sport so much. And we are happy to give the benefit of the doubt in a way. We allow corrupt officials, oligarchs, to use these systems to actually undermine our democracy. Now we have been seeing, so not to sound vague, we have been seeing that with sanctions. There are hundreds of cases before the European Court of Justice, introduced by oligarchs who are trying to get rid of the designations. So far, the lawyers of the Commission of the EU have been winning cases, but the briefs, the evidence behind many of the sanctions is not good enough. And I'm sure that the legal kind of our instinct for rule of law would actually start removing sanctions. Courts will start removing sanctions across Europe. So in a way, we and we'll say, okay, this is the rule of law for its independent court. But I mean, we need to be more vigilant about this. And that's why we need your economic security strategy, which changed the way we treat, these kind of problems of strategic corruption. This is not about, giving the benefit of the doubt to everyone. It's about changing the way Europe works as a foreign policy actor, which means actually putting a lot of resource institutions under common objective, which is basically to find ways to get rid of these oligarch networks out of the country, and not to allow them to use our vulnerabilities in order to continue doing business as usual.
Claudia, your words of wisdom.
Well, I don't know, but something that I can share. I've been working on anti-corruption for a long time. Actually, tomorrow is my 15-year anniversary at the Institute.
Congratulations.
And if there's one thing I've learned is that corruption is not the work of a few isolated rotten apples. Corruption, as Martin has very vividly and eloquently portrayed, is networked. It's about networks. And this is the fact. The people who are into corruption, they are really good at building these networks and nurturing these networks and activating these networks. And we need to do the same as anti-corruption and peace. And, I very much like Ara's point, we operate in silos we shouldn't, because there are so many synergies, so many complementarities. And the corrupt are mega organized, and it's embarrassing that we are not more organized. So that's my
That's why it's so good that TI 20 years ago has already tried to establish a transparency-focused defense and security initiative. I'm glad that 20 years later it's still around, and hopefully more and more people are listening. So what do you have to say?
I had some, I really like that. I would say talk to the experts, bring an anti-corruption person to the table, and make them a part of meaningful conversations. And this is something that works for the governments and works for civil society. So make sure that when you are in a project, you are consulting. If you don't have anybody in your team, you are consulting with partners and NGOs that might have expertise that you can add to that. So, and equally talk to the security providers too, and understand if they have an anti-corruption expert embedded. Plan it. That's just plan for it. And what I was saying about making anti-corruption central on big strategy and the doctrine and so on. So just plan for it, make it central. Yes, don't come as a silent. And this is, and maybe addressing the question asked. We often say to governments like the UK that they're supporting corruption. So they are doing very well in their own country at certain levels and defense and security, but they're not doing that well internationally. So when they are sending weapons to countries that have high critical risk of corruption, they are sending troops to countries. So like security assistance. So it's not only what you do at home, plan it what you do at home, plan it what you do internationally too. And the last point is don't shy away of an inconvenient conclusions, which I think applies to a lot of our work. Is that often when you do a risk assessment or conflict assessment or gender analysis, you find some things, you find that maybe that person is corrupt, or the counterpart that the high level civil servant that you are interacting is corrupt. Just don't shy away of those conclusions. Yes.
And the consequences. It may mean that some of your key counterparts cannot actually include them, because if you do, even if it's for the sake of peace, you will perpetuate. And I think, Olena, we will finish with you, and hope that we will no longer have to speak about war, but we can speak about peace in Ukraine, that we won't have to talk about corruption anymore. Perhaps we in the West also take away as a, in Western Europe here, take away as a message that would also reinforce this good economic section as it relates.
Yeah, thank you. I definitely agree with my co-panelists that we should have a holistic approach, that we shouldn't stay within our silos. And for us, for example, it was in Ukraine an experience during this full-scale invasion that we saw things so clearly and so holistically, because the war, it exposes everything. It takes off the masks, of all this economic Russian influence, all that, and you all see that. It's just, it's a mafia, it's organized crime, it's a network. It's exactly very much clear and exposed. And we need, as professionals, to study more such cases to prevent this spreading around the world. And the message that I want to finish our panel with is that, here we should remember, when you asked about BRICS, about how the world is influenced by all the sectors, we should remember that we, maybe not all of us, but some of you, we used to live in a bipolar world where there was USSR and Western access with the US on top. And USSR, they have this playbook how to use so-called active measures around the world to basically influence other countries through corruption, through conflict, through information operations. And what Putin is now doing, he didn't invent it. It was all created in USSR. Take democratic society, exploit its weaknesses, turn right against the left, turn Black Lives Matter against the right-wing people. And we see this in corruption narrative as well. We expose troll farms where people were paid to write about how corrupt Ukrainian army is and how our military is not equipped. And this is all known. And I think that we should understand it better. Here in the West, people don't fully understand these active measures, these playbooks. And these people in BRICS, like you mentioned, other countries, no, they are not as good as Russia. Russia was USSR. They were on the top because they were spreading influence around the world. Those other countries, they are just students, because they have long legacy. And Europe doesn't have such playbook because Europe was not dominating the world in such a way. And they cannot process what is being done to them. And I think they should study more those methods. That's first of all, to understand better when they are being played like this. And my second last message is that they need to show that they are not soft, they are not lenient, they are not inviting all these active measures on them, all these influences, because Russia attacked Ukraine because they thought that Ukraine has a very soft, pro-Russian, anti-war president. And this is why softness, this vulnerability invites aggression. And my, for example, argument right now is that in Taiwan, their sort of pro-war president who said, if China invades, we will fight. My argument is that it decreases the likelihood of armed conflict because this is same thing in Europe. If they see Europe is not ready for war, if Europe says we don't need to make any weapons, we don't need any hardliners, because we want to be peaceful with Russia. Do you think Russia will be peaceful with you? My message is unlikely. This is not how their mind works.
And this, sorry, I cannot stop myself. This is freedom market in Berlin. It's happening again. I was in Berlin in September to present a report on Russian economic influence in Germany. At the same time, there was a forum organized by the German foreign policy DGAP, the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Außenpolitik, which is like the state in a way. They made a forum about how to get ceasefire in Ukraine. I'm like, guys, we are not there. What ceasefire? This is exactly what Russia wants to hear. And the gap is not, delinking. Now, this is like center-right institute. So, I mean, these kind of narratives come creeping back, and we have a window of opportunity, which is narrowing each month. And this opportunity might actually slip away if Trump is reelected in November. So we need to use these 10 months now to really crack down on this. This freedom talk should be out of the question right now. Sorry, this is a peace forum. It is not a peace. We shouldn't talk about peace in Ukraine right now.
Yeah.
This is only enabling Russia. Sorry.
At least nobody said Gaza for 2 hours.
Yeah, that's, I mean, but
Yeah.
I also have to disappoint you,
Yeah.
Martin, because, this, whatever forum you saw in Berlin, it does nothing to beat our own foreign minister who was announced that Switzerland hosted the peace forum, who, to bring peace to Ukraine, which just made me, so embarrassed, I have to admit. No, but I think it's the start of a dialogue, but it's not a dialogue we can take very leisurely at a leisurely pace. It's ultra urgent, and I think you guys have really helped us drive this point down. I'm going to personally, I've succeeded, and I'm really proud of that. But it's also just a tiny piece in the whole puzzle to actually get the Munich Security Conference, which is probably the most conservative gathering of security and defense people. They all walk around in their uniforms with things on it, to have a plenary panel in the main program on corruption, which I'll moderate with really fantastic people. So I'm hoping we can crack into these communities. I think convincing the peace people is much easier than convincing the generals at the Munich Security Forum. But I mean, every person counts. You said we're 40 in this room, so 40 people now go and fight for peace through anti-corruption and anti-corruption through peace. So thank you so much. It was really exciting, and thank you hugely to our fantastic panelists. Thank you.